it's burned in my memory. And I was trick-or-treating at a neighbor's house, and I was with my brother and 2 other kids. And we were in kind of the entryway to the home because we came in. They invited us in, and someone, it was not me, knocked over something, and it broke. But it was assumed that I had done it, and I was called a Chinese N-word, and it was, I didn't know what it meant, honestly, but it was just like seared into my memory. Yeah. And like reflecting on it later, it was just kind of shocking that that's what someone would say to a small child. I think it was probably 4 or 5 maybe. And so thinking back on that now, it just, I felt shame. I didn't know what it meant, but I felt like I didn't even knock this thing over, and I'm like feeling all this negativity at me, and it felt really bad.
Good afternoon, Chris.
Good afternoon.
Would you, for those who may not be as familiar with your work, would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. My name is Chris Punongbayan, and I'm the Executive Director of California ChangeLawyers. Our mission is to build a better justice system for all Californians, and one of the main ways that we do this is by empowering the next generation of legal changemakers, and we call these folks ChangeLawyers. So we used to be known as the California Bar Foundation, and that work is still a core part of our work. We provide scholarships for law students, public interest fellowships for students interested in working for a summer in the public interest or for a year-long position after law school. And then we also provide grants for diversity pipeline programs throughout the state of California.
And if you mentioned that the mission of the organization is to, I think you said, support change makers.
Yes.
So what is a change maker in your view?
Sure. Well, I'll answer it by saying who we believe can be a change maker, and that's everyone. So regardless of whether you are practicing in the big law context or in the private firm context, working in the public sector as a district attorney, or in the public interest, we believe that you can change our legal system, our policies in order to build a more fair and just California. So we think that right now, the state of California doesn't have a legal profession that reflects the great diversity of the state. And so by empowering young, diverse law students and young lawyers to become powerful and influential in the profession, they can then change the systems of inequity that are causing so many Californians to struggle today still.
And I wonder if you wouldn't mind placing that in context for us a little bit. So California is a majority minority state, and that's one way to put it. And but the legal system, while the composition of the legal system and the judiciary has been changing, we're still a far cry from representative. And so wondering if you could place that in context for us and explain your work in light of that difference.
So the state is a majority people of color state. I think around 60% of the state identifies as coming from a diverse background. But in the legal profession, still, only 1 in 5 lawyers come from diverse racial backgrounds, and only 1 in 3 judges, state judges, come from diverse backgrounds. California is a slight majority women, but men are still the majority in the profession and on the bench. So even though we benefit from having a very diverse demographic population, those benefits are not transferring into the legal profession. And so what we want to do is to have a legal profession and a public sector that represents the great diversity of the state.
And your organization focuses on lawyers and law students as changemakers and potential changemakers. Why that particular focus on our profession as change-making agents?
Yes, I think because lawyers have a very powerful role to play in society. I can't think of another profession where when you get your license, you're sworn to uphold the Constitution of the United States. And to me, that's such a noble calling. And it's not sometimes what we as lawyers are known for. And so we want to underscore and highlight and give visibility to the voices of those in our profession who believe that the law should work for everyone, that regardless of your background, whether race or gender identity, sexual orientation, class background, that when you walk into that courtroom or when you engage with the legal system, that you'll be dealt a fair hand. And diversity is not the only way to achieve equity and equality in the law, but it's certainly predicate to us getting to that more fair and just state. So we believe that by increasing diversity, representation in the law, there'll be more trust in the system. Because right now I think it's the case that many communities of color don't feel that the legal system will treat them fairly. And certainly, there's news articles way too frequently about how injustices are being meted out through the course of our legal system. And again, diversity in and of itself is not the only solution, but it will go far, I think, in bringing us to a more representative democracy and a more fair legal system.
And wondering if you wouldn't mind, sharing something about your professional path.
Sure.
Because I know that you've been involved in law and policy and direct services for a number of years since you graduated from UCLA. Perhaps we can start at school.
Yes.
And what was it about your experience in school that helped you on that path to public interest work?
Yeah, well, I didn't go to law school right out of college. I took 3 years off, and I was born and raised and worked right after college in the East Coast. I was working in New York in various nonprofits, and after college, I was really trying to think about what my path was going to be. And so, I thought maybe I'll be a social worker, maybe I'll be a community organizer, or maybe I'll be a journalist. And, when I was in college, I thought I was going to go to law school. And so I took the LSAT, applied, but then I just said, I'm not ready to go yet. But I knew I wanted to get to California somehow because growing up Filipino in the East Coast, there weren't a lot of us. And so just learning about Asian American history in college and Filipino American history, I said, I want to make it out to California. So while I was doing that kind of soul searching about the career that I wanted to have, I ended up landing again that I did want to go to law school. And my LSATs had not yet expired, which was great because I think I maybe would have taken the GRE.
Who wants to take the LSATs?
Oh gosh, no. Well, I did, but I didn't want to do it again after many years of being out of college at that point. So I applied to school in California, and I think because I had spent some time working in nonprofits and volunteering and being on boards of nonprofits as in my early 20s, I think I went into law school knowing what I wanted to do. And I applied and got into UCLA's public interest law program and critical race studies program, and it was the best kind of mix of the theoretical as well as the practical in terms of understanding how we don't have a race-blind system and justice truly is not blind in America, and the ways that we can work to improve to make a more perfect union and a stronger democracy. So so while I was in law school, I will say I didn't feel the pressure to do the on-campus interviewing that a lot of my peers were going through, because I knew I wanted to do public interest, and I knew I wanted to serve the community. And I did have a hard time in my first year of law school. It was actually I moved from New York in August of 2001, and then September 11th happened within my first month of law school, and it really just felt like I had made a mistake coming to California and leaving behind all the work that I had done in New York at the time. And so it was hard. It was a hard first year, but what really turned it around for me was my first year summer clerkship, where I got to do the work that I had uprooted myself and to come across the country to be able to do, which is doing my first summer was doing immigration work, specifically removal defense, and helping people who were in immigration detention in Southern California. And so just having the access as a law student to a detention facility and being able to take on some cases and arguing a case in immigration court by the end of my summer just felt like a complete validation that I had made the right choice, because the first year of law school was really hard.
Yeah, I bet. And one thing that I observed from that story is that even before law school and after college, you were thinking about lines of work that are really about making change. Social work, community organizer, and journalist, I think, were the three things I think you identified. Yeah. And you wind up going to a public interest program in law school. I wonder, what was it about, what was it about those particular lines that were attractive to you?
I think it just must have been instilled in me from my parents around the value of giving back and being generous and just trying to help out our fellow human beings. And in college, I was an Asian American Studies major, and I really just got the history lesson about the United States that I didn't really get until I started really taking these types of courses. And it was kind of like an awakening, like my consciousness was just brought to this level where I felt like I had so much privilege going to an Ivy League university. I went to Brown University, and feeling like I can make a difference, and I just had a belief that I could make a difference, and I never let go of that. And so going into public interest work just seemed, in law, just seemed like the right choice. And looking at the impact that those other professions have, I just felt like they were all meaningful and impactful, but I guess maybe based on my personality type or, where I just felt like I might be best served in kind of the long term of my career, that law was the best choice.
I believe you grew up in a rural part of Massachusetts, and your parents were immigrants from the Philippines. You've described elsewhere her explaining why she made the choice to immigrate. I wonder if you wouldn't mind relating that story.
Yeah, well, it was actually when I was taking an Asian American Studies class at Brown, where the assignment was just to kind of interview someone, to learn that skill of interviewing and storytelling. So I said, I'll just interview my mom.
Right.
And I think for years and years, I never asked, and she never told me kind of what her life was like growing up in the Philippines. And so she, was very young when World War II happened, and how her family had to live in the mountains, during the Japanese occupation in the Philippines. And I just never heard those stories until I started asking, but they were all there. But ultimately, fast forward to the early 1970s, when she ultimately made the decision to come to the United States with my dad at that time, and my older brother was less than one, at the time that they immigrated. But they were living under martial law under President Marcos at the time, where the right to vote, the right to assembly, the right to freedom of the press were not readily available to the population. And there was also economic opportunity in the United States. And so she just told me that how she felt like there was going to be a better life for her family and her children in particular by coming to the United States. And so, it's just curious how some immigrants from Asia end up in certain parts of the country.
Yeah.
So my parents first came to California very quickly, but then moved to New York, and then permanently basically landed in Massachusetts in a very rural part. And one funny thing I like to say about growing up that you wouldn't know about me is that I learned how to milk a cow because I grew up next to a dairy farm and learned that skill that rural Massachusetts people sometimes learn. But it was just hearing about what her life was like, and again, realizing the privileges that I had growing up in this country just made me feel like it was the right thing to give back, because my parents had given me so much and instilled in me those values of just seeking opportunity. And also, one thing that, my mom in particular really taught me was just speaking up for yourself. And, I grew up in a rural part of Massachusetts. There weren't a lot of other Asian Americans there, or people from the Latinx community or Black community. And so sometimes it felt like we were one of a kind. And not to let that limit us in what we thought we could be, even though others had pretty sharp expectations of who we were. So that was, just looking back on it now, I'm very grateful, to have had the background that I have and the family that I have, because they've definitely led to where I am today.
So I grew up in a similar environment in Detroit and then Flint, Michigan, and sometimes I wonder whether stereotypes that children of color experience, whether they're I don't know how to describe it, but whether they're better or worse depending on exposure to a certain minority group. I think I will say that stereotypes become more nuanced. But I do observe that a lot of the anti-immigrant, anti-minority sentiment that we happen to be experiencing in this particular moment is, at least it appears to me often, and I think the data confirms it, that it often appears to be in areas where there is not a lot of direct interaction with immigrants and minorities. But as you say, there definitely does seem to be a very firm or specific opinion on about immigrants and minorities in many of those communities.
Yeah.
You grew up in rural Massachusetts. Where in Massachusetts was that?
Well, I was born in Worcester, Massachusetts.
Oh, Worcester.
Yes. The claim to fame to the hospital that I was born was that 2 new kids on the block were born in that same hospital. Wow. But I grew up in a small town called Dudley, which was central Mass, right on the border of Connecticut. Yeah. So, we had to go to the town next over to go to a McDonald's. It was like that small.
I've seen the highway signs. And so for you personally, your parents are immigrants, you're in Dudley, Massachusetts. My guess is there aren't too many other Filipino children in the area. What was that like for you? What stands out for you?
There were other families that were Filipino immigrants. They just weren't very close geographically to us, but around like Easter or Christmas or Thanksgiving, all families would all get together. But mostly other than that, felt we weren't around, other members of the community too much. And so I think I grew up feeling like I was like everyone else. We were going to the same school and going to the same church and shopping in the same places. And then there was a really just it's burned in my memory, and every time I do one of these exercises where it's what is your first memory of being made aware of your race? And it was a super negative experience where I was trick-or-treating at a neighbor's house, and I was with my brother and 2 other kids. And we were in kind of the entryway to the home because we came in. They invited us in, and someone, it was not me, knocked over something and it broke. But it was assumed that I had done it, and I was called a Chinese N-word, and it was. I didn't know what it meant, honestly, but it was just like seared into my memory. And like reflecting on it later, it was just kind of shocking that that's what someone would say to a small child. I think it was probably 4 or 5 maybe. And so thinking back on that now, it just, I felt shame. I didn't know what it meant, but I felt like I didn't even knock this thing over, and I'm like feeling all this negativity at me. And it felt really bad, I remember at the time, but it wasn't until years later that I could kind of unpack what had happened. But, that notwithstanding, I did feel like I was able to fit in, and my parents had always provided for us, but it were just some circumstances like that. Or there was another time I remember where I was standing outside the dentist office waiting to get picked up by my parents, and then this car drove up, and then this kid in the front seat, because kids could ride in the front seat back then, rolled down the window and then just made eyes at me and like put his fingers on his eyes and to make them slanted. And it was like a drive-by sort of experience. And it was just stuff like that reminded me that even though I felt like I felt like I fit in, I was just an easy target for not fitting in. So those were some of the things that I remember growing up in rural Massachusetts.
Yeah, I feel like almost every child in that circumstance has a story like that, where all of a sudden it becomes clear that, oh, you think of me like that. You think of me through that racial lens, even where I may not have realized it.
I'm just going to the dentist and getting my teeth cleaned, or I'm just trick-or-treating, and then it's just everyday things that sometimes are not every day for everyone.
It's thinking about how that might have related to your choices of your profession. But one thing that I observe is that you work on policy matters that are very close to you and to your identity. And so wondering how you chose, or, kind of what is it about those policy matters that you focused on that resonate with you so much?
The thing that I can really point to and look back on that just gave me crystal clarity about I guess what I'm supposed to do is when I came out in college, and it was like something was pulled out from over my eyes that was covering me from really seeing myself, but also like what was going on in the world. I think maybe even more so than my racial consciousness, like identifying now as a member of the LGBT community, just gave me so much clarity around belonging, and the feeling of not belonging and not knowing why, before I came out was pretty profound. And I just felt like, gosh, what can we do to make people feel like they belong, like everyone can belong? And what can we do to change the circumstances that make it feel like someone would have to be in the closet? I mean, it's different now, many generations out from, the mid-90s when I came out, but it's still true. I mean, I see stories of like young children who are bullied, because of their identity, whether it's by religion or gender identity or sexual orientation, that there's so much that we still need to do, and it just feels not right for me to be a bystander on that. And so what I can do to try and change law and policy to create an atmosphere and the conditions whereby acceptance and inclusion and belonging can then flow from that, that's where I feel like I'm called to be.
And if you don't mind sharing, I mean, what was the that path for you personally that gave you the courage and the comfort to come out?
It was really, I was just telling this story to somebody last week, but it's just how visibility in the mainstream media really matters. And I remember watching the movie Clueless, and there was a gay character in it named Christian, and I said, oh, that's very close to Chris. And it just was like, oh my gosh, he's like the best friend of this character, and he's totally himself, and it just was the thing that helped me admit to myself that I was gay. And I mean, I knew it, but just seeing the representation in a mainstream movie that was really popular just gave me like the feeling that it was going to be okay. And it was very hard to come out to family and to friends. And it was harder to come out to family than friends. But it got better and it got easier. And it's, you learn as an LGBT person that you're never done coming out. Like you're always coming out, and it's just part of who it is, but it's that visibility that maybe will make a difference for someone else. And so it's important to tell the story, to tell my story, and for people like me to tell our stories, because maybe it'll give someone else the inspiration and the courage to do the same things for them, whether it's their identity or speaking up against something that they're facing that isn't right and not knowing what's the right thing to do. But the courage to speak up is an important virtue, I think, that we should all cultivate.
And having that courage is important if you're going to be a change maker.
That's right. It's being a change maker doesn't mean you win all the time. It's sometimes you lose, and sometimes it takes a long time, and sometimes you're surprised and it happens really fast. So it's the full range of human experience being a change maker.
Chris, you talked about your experience in college coming out, but you you phrased it in terms of what it meant to you, and one of the things it meant is finding belonging. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, I think it means just being who you are and your whole self and all your identities, and the place where you are is accepting of that. And it's that when I feel like I belong, I feel like people get me, and I don't have to explain. Well, in case you don't know, this is what this means. It's just a feeling of, I guess maybe it's not sameness, but it's almost like, what is it? Maybe it's like celebration almost, like a quiet celebration. Like, yes, I'm really happy you're here, kind of feeling. And that's, I guess, what I mean by belonging.
You also described that the process of coming out to friends and family, and that it was more challenging to come out to family than friends. But I've heard it described by other APAs what it was like to come out to one's family. But it's can be difficult no matter what your national origin.
Yeah.
But your parents grew up during World War II in the Philippines, immigrated at a time of martial law, and then they wound up in California, then ultimately in rural Massachusetts. What was it like to come out to your closest family, your parents?
It was, I was scared. But I think by that point, I had felt enough validation and acceptance from my peer network and friends, and that it felt like I couldn't not tell them. I couldn't not tell my family, who I love dearly and who loved me dearly, this secret that I had about myself. And it was, what's the word? Sequenced. It wasn't like called a family meeting. It was, one family member at a time, and it took some time for my family to adjust and to accept the new reality. But I'm happy to say now that my family is very accepting and loving of me and my partner and the kids that we've adopted, and so it feels really good. But it took a long time to get here.
After college, you wound up working in New York City in a variety of organizations, and then you had it in your mind that you wanted to be in California at some point. And for me, growing up in Michigan, I had an image of California, but it wasn't until I actually arrived in California that I realized, wow, there's a lot here that I never would have imagined, right? And one of those things for me as an Asian American is seeing generations of Asian American culture.
Yes.
A real hyphenated culture.
Yes.
That was it was really eye-opening for me personally. I wonder what that journey was like for you, and what was attractive about coming to California when you did in law school.
Yeah, I think when I was in college still, doing my Asian American Studies major, I did my senior thesis on third-generation Filipino Americans because I literally knew none growing up, and that was just not the immigration story of many Filipinos who immigrated in the 60s and 70s to the East Coast, because the immigration story of Filipinos to the West Coast was much longer. It happened starting in the 1900s, during the colonial period, because the Asian exclusion laws didn't apply to the colony, and so Filipinos were brought to the United States as a labor force in Hawaii and the plantations on the West Coast, and just learning stories like that was my community, but that was not anyone that I knew. Was like, I needed to understand this more. So I did my senior thesis basis and came out to California and interviewed, third generation, the grandchildren of the immigrants, their stories. And it was just, it's probably funny to say it right now, being as I'm from California now, but at the time in like the late 90s, I just had never met anyone like that. So when I decided to ultimately move here, and it was just like maybe that feeling of belonging again, but that being Filipino in California was it was a little more every day because there were so many here. The stories and the history and the activism were generations old, that it was so normal, and it was just so like I could just be myself and blend right in, and I didn't stick out like a sore thumb. It was just a great kind of coming home in a way, even though I'm not even from here.
Yeah, a lot of that resonates with me personally, but I observe that over time, in different ways, through different aspects of your identity, finding a sense of belonging and finding a place of, where you can feel comfort and feel at home while also driving change. That seems to be if I can observe a theme in your path.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it like that, but I think that's right.
Well, it's one thing to decide on a path of change making, but I think it's quite another thing to believe that you can make change. And having that belief that a person, an individual, can make a difference. In some of the roles that you've occupied and the work that you've done, it's just my intuition that you believe that you can make a difference. And so wondering if that's true, how you came to that belief and what you can share about finding that confidence in change making with people who might be watching.
Yeah, I think for me, it's that finding that voice and that belief, and it's knowing that it's a path that you need to travel with others, that, learning about Asian American history here, and all of the activists who kind of came before me, who were already doing the work that I could learn from, and then building my peer network within the legal community and beyond. It's the power of working together with others that I think helps instill this belief that change is possible. A lot of things do start with one courageous voice, and I think the efforts that make it over the finish line are when those voices, those courageous voices at the beginning, catalyze movement and the inclusion of others into the work. And so when I was working at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Asian Law Caucus here in San Francisco, that was certainly the case where we used the law in partnership with community to bring about changes that we would want to see. And so it's an interesting model. We called it community lawyering, where lawyers and members of the community organizers, community-based organizations figure out the strategies together and figure out the solutions together. But it's rooted not only in the voices of our clients, but it's the voices of the community members, sometimes who aren't your direct clients, but would be impacted by the results of a favorable case, for example.
Oh, I see. So in that respect, community lawyering, as you looked at it at ALC, is a form of impact lawyering.
Yes, exactly. Because I think it's when law is most powerful when members of the community believe in the change as well. And so it's kind of that coming together of legal resources and community to bring about the change that I think is really powerful and transformative, and gives you the belief, gives the community the belief, the lawyers the belief that more change is possible. So I'll give an example. back in 2008, when I had started at ALC, we had a number of undocumented Asian young people for whom there was no immigration relief. This was before DACA. And it was the power of bringing them together. They all came to us because they wondered if there was anything that we could do for them as community lawyers, and the answer was no. But it was kind of a rare opportunity because we had like a small group of people who we were able to help. And so, I worked with our staff attorneys, and we started coming together to coalesce to form what became a young person's organization within ALC called Aspire. And it really became kind of like a home and a safe space for undocumented Asian young people, but evolved into a force for community organizing for Asian American undocumented young people. And so there were cases that we had taken up where some of the members of the organization Aspire were facing removal. And so we took the case, but it was an opportunity to raise visibility about the fact that immigration enforcement impacts Asian Americans also. And it's, just kind of creating a more inclusive narrative about how immigration impacts all immigrant communities. And Asian Americans and Asian immigrants have so much at stake in how immigration policy, what the consequences are of changes in immigration policy. So that was an example of law and community coming together to imagine positive change and imagine, that change is possible. And so we helped to bring together undocumented Asian young people alongside undocumented and members of the Latinx immigrant community. And we're part of the force that helped bring about DACA under President Obama. So it's just an example, I think, of community lawyering at its finest.
I sense from you that you're an optimistic person, and to engage in work to achieve long-term change. I would think one has to be both determined and optimistic.
Yes.
What gives you optimism today that? Sitting here in the present moment and November 2019, when we've experienced the things we have, and we've experienced a lot. We experienced, I think what's fair to say, a very divisive presidential campaign. In 2016, we experienced Charlottesville and the murder of a counter-protester, Heather Heyer. We are experiencing a period of very, very sharp divisions in our country. At a certain point, we'll have a change in leadership in our country, one way or the other. But what allows us to move forward and to heal and to come back together as a country?
I think for me, it's knowing that the pendulum of civil rights in the history of the country has swung back and forth. So after the end of the Civil War, we had the Reconstruction Amendments, and after that, the pendulum swung the other way. And it wasn't until what some call the second Reconstruction of the civil rights era of the 1950s and 60s that we saw, the recognition in law and policy and Supreme Court cases about the humanity of people of color in the United States. And we are in the pendulum swinging the other way right now. And I think we can't lose sight of the fact that we can control the pendulum, that we do need to push it in the other direction. But it is if we look at the history of the United States, it's actually organized people who believe that the status quo can change, who have actually made it happen. And so we are in a sharply polarized time right now, and I think we have to keep our eyes on the things that will make change in the short term, in terms of defending what we have gained, and then also imagining and fighting for the things that are going to make our country swing back into the direction of inclusion and fairness and civil and human rights for all.
So it sounds like at least part of that is for people of color. I'm just imagining people of color to be active and engaged in the process.
Oh yes, that's a core principle that we believe at ChangeLawyers is that the people who are closest to the problem are the people who hold the solutions, and so how can we give visibility and voice to the people who are closest to the problem in order to bring about changes in law and policy, and how the law can be a leverage point to bring us closer to that. That's kind of part of our theory of change, I guess you'd say.
Chris, I wonder if I can ask, whether it's in your work or outside of work, what are the projects that and the change that you're committed to right now?
Well, one thing that I'm excited to talk about, because it's something that we at ChangeLawyers have been looking at for the past several months, but it's relevant to diversity and inclusion in the legal profession, which is addressing the racial disparity in California bar exam pass rates. And so the numbers show that for many, many years, there has been a profound disparity in the pass rates of California test takers of the bar exam by race. And even though I think many people know that it's been happening, there hasn't been as much of a concerted effort, I would say, as there is now to address head-on the issue of racial disparity in pass rates. So, for example, in the July 2018 sitting of the bar exam, the pass rate of whites than African Americans who took the test was almost twice. And what this means is that the law is not reflecting the diversity of the state because African Americans, Latinx, and Asian American test takers are not able to pass at the same rate. And this is becoming a more pronounced issue because more people of color are taking the bar exam with every sitting. July 2018 was also the first time that there was a majority of people of color who were taking the test. So the racial disparity in pass rates, I think, is only going to get more pronounced over time. So what we're doing in collaboration with the ACLU of California and Impact Fund is just telling that story, that in fact there is a racial disparity in pass rates, and if we look at some solutions, there are many solutions. There's not a single thing that's going to increase diversity in the profession, but one thing is looking at addressing this racial disparity. And so I'm hopeful that we'll be able to gain more momentum on this issue, draw attention to it, and hopefully there will be a change that will be made in order to address the racial disparity in pass rates. And specifically, it's related to the cut score or the pass score of the California bar exam, because California has the second highest cut score of any bar exam in the country. And when you look at the complexity of law in terms of the state state practice, we're at least as complicated as New York, as sophisticated as New York, but the pass rate of New York is 133, California's is 144, and the national median is 135. So people who are qualified to practice law in New York can't pass the bar in California, but they're very successful attorneys in New York. And so we're drawing attention to this issue, and invite others to become more informed about this particular issue.
Well, we just recently received the results of the July 2019 bar exam, and for those for those lucky enough to pass, the pass rate rose to about 60%, or slightly over, if I'm recalling correctly. And you mentioned that the July 2018 administration was the first where there were a majority of minority test takers.
Yes.
Wondering if you have the data yet to discern whether the disparity in pass rates increased or decreased from the 2018 to 2019 administration.
The data has not yet been released by race. So the overall pass rate between first-time and repeat takers was released, but the racial demographic breakdown is not yet available, and I think will be made available towards the end of December. So that will be certainly looking closely to see, if the disparity continues. My suspicion is that it will, and it'll just provide more evidence and hopefully more of a call for this issue to be addressed.
And of the various things that you're working on, why is this issue one you're passionate about?
Yeah, I think because there are so many attorneys of color or would-be attorneys of color who want to give back to their communities, that this issue is just preventing very qualified people from being able to practice law. And it's an issue where there's a strong business case for it, that law firms and clients are requiring or definitely more interested in having a more diverse legal workforce, and yet the state is not allowing these people to become practitioners in big law. Certainly in public interest, we know that in California, there's only one attorney for every 7,000 indigent Californians who are in need of legal help. So from the full spectrum of the legal community, we would stand to benefit from having more practitioners of color in the field, and changing those numbers that I mentioned earlier about only 1 in 5 attorneys being attorneys of color. There are other changes that need to be made in the profession to create more welcoming spaces for attorneys of color and women and LGBT attorneys, and we definitely need to be looking at the pipeline starting as early as high school and certainly college, to create more access points for people to join the profession. But the cut score is something that is really within our control versus those other changes, which may take more time.
We've been talking about externally focused change and making lasting changes in society. You've been at the helm of organizations that have gone through substantial changes themselves, and I believe you were at Advancing Justice around the time, or not, maybe a little bit after the time when ALC became part of the ambitious 5-city Advancing Justice Collaborative, which, as I understand it, that was quite a process to even make that decision. And then you are at the helm of what was formerly, I believe, called the California Bar Foundation.
Yes.
And now is California ChangeLawyers. So you've been at organizations or shepherded them at times of change. I have to imagine, at times of change, things don't always go as smoothly as one might hope. Just wondering for, those young leaders out there who might also be experiencing change in their organizations, whether you have any tips for, being successful at achieving change within one's own organization.
Yeah, I think the thing that comes to me is just kind of remembering your North Star, like identifying it, grappling with it, and naming it, and never letting go of it. Because the changes that come within an organization or within the field or the community, there's a lot of reasons to say no. There's a lot of reasons to not do things differently, because the status quo is, sometimes really easy to hang on to. But if you're remembering that North Star about where you want to be as a person or an organization, that is the light in the darkness that will inspire you and encourage you when you're feeling down or feeling distracted. That to me, I think, is something that is a tip, I guess, that I'd recommend, is like identifying your North Star.
And if you're willing to share, what is your North Star?
I think my North Star is the belief that we can find our shared humanity again, and that we will see each other as full people and not stereotypes or reductions or less than human. And I gotta believe that we will do that again. And someone once told me, and it makes a lot of sense, it's really hard to hate up close, and it's really uncomfortable getting up close to difference. But it's something that I'm really trying to embrace for myself. But it's in service of this belief in our shared humanity.
And if I may ask, what makes for a meaningful life?
I think it's living life in the full 360 experience, because I think that what's really taught me a lesson about this, living a meaningful life, is the story of my partner and my adopting our two kids, because we adopted from the foster care system here in San Francisco, and it's a complicated process, and there's many things that can go wrong, and there's many things that do go wrong in the lives of children who are in the foster system. And just being able to see the experiences of all of our neighbors and all of our fellow Californians in their fullest, I think, is extremely humbling and extremely saddening sometimes. And at the same time, my adoption experience has been incredibly joyful and incredibly profound, and it's because it was so complicated, and it is complicated still, that has made me feel like I've had a meaningful life, and I hope I have many more years. But it's just that things shouldn't always be all good, and things shouldn't be easy, because that's when the experiences are actually the opposite of that or different from that, is when we understand ourselves better. We understand I can understand how I feel and respond and react in the face of adversity, and accepting it and being reminded of that North Star, and just holding on to it and persevering through challenging times. I think that has made me feel like I have had a meaningful life so far.
Well, thank you for the work you do and for cultivating change.
Oh, thank you so much. It's a pleasure.